Au revoir, mon poupou. Let me just take the...
This feels so cool. I always love filming in your chair. Hi sweetpeas, happy Thursday and also happy Pride! I did say that I wanted to do some more LGBT plus stuff on this channel, and what better way to start than going right back to the beginning with how Pride kind of started. It's Pride this weekend, at least in London. So yeah, it just seemed very fitting. So some of you may have heard of Stonewall. Stonewall is the name of a rather large charity. It got its name because of the origin story that I'm going to share with you guys today. It's also the name of an inn in New York where Pride, if you could call it that back then, the beginning of the LGBT plus rights liberation movement began 50 years ago this year. And this is a really cool milestone to be celebrating. 50 years. If it wasn't for those brave people back then who did what they did, we would not have the freedom to be ourselves now. And for that, I, in particular, am very grateful. So before I begin, I have 2 rules, please. The first is, I would like for this to be a safe space. The internet is a place for freedom of expression. I do not wish to limit this. However, I want to keep my little bubble, this corner of the internet, a safe space, so please be respectful. Be kind in the comments. If you don't know something, feel free to ask questions, but just ensure they're respectful questions. It's absolutely fine to not know something. In my eyes, I don't think there's any stupid questions about this. I don't want to see people shaming people for being like, oh, how could you not know that? Because the only reason I know this is because I did thorough research and looked into it, and the only reason that anyone's ever going to know is if they're brave enough to ask and people are kind enough to answer. So be kind. We all want to learn more. We all want to improve ourselves, and so that is what I'm hoping to do today. I've done some research and compiled the little Stonewall timeline of how it all began, and the second thing that I want to say is please keep open-minded. One thing that I really don't want to do today is start up a debate on what actually happened. Please trust me when I say that I have done my research. I've looked into lots of different accounts from lots of different historians, and I know that the accounts of history are always going to be very different because we all weren't there. Naturally, there will be things that vary, but I've kept this quite high level and quite vague. So if you've never heard of Stonewall before, or actually what happened that night or over the course of those 6 days, hopefully we can all get something out of it. And with that, let's dive straight into it. I am actually going to be reading, I don't know if you can see it from my laptop. There are a lot of facts to string together, so I just want to make sure that I'm definitely doing it justice and reporting things correctly. I'll include references where I can, because I really don't want to get anything wrong. So, are you sitting comfortably? So all of this started in 1930, where the Stonewall Inn was reportedly a tea room. That was like the mask that the building had, but what it really was a speakeasy. And speakeasies are essentially bars from that period that sold alcohol but did so illegally because they didn't have a license to do that. So why was selling alcohol illegal? Well, in the States, the US, in the 20s to 30s, there was a period of time known as the Prohibition. And that period came out from lots of people being very loose with their liquor, should we say. It caused a lot of health issues, it caused a lot of family violence, it also caused a lot of corruption that was happening in the political spheres, and a lot of people who called themselves the Dries, which I think is like such a cool term. I don't know why, I just really like it. They basically got sick of the influence that alcohol was having, and so they decided to cure all of society from this illness, this perversion with alcohol. It led to a ban on alcohol nationwide, and there were even groups of people like police who were called the Prohibition Agents that would go to places and check that there was no alcohol there and take away any alcohol that was being there that shouldn't have been there. Naughty alcohol. But speakeasies existed because alcohol was so popular, and there were so many of them because it was in so much demand that realistically the Prohibition agents couldn't really keep up with keeping all of it in check and making sure that it was all taken away. And so that is what the Stonewall Inn was, really, a speakeasy. The Stonewall Inn in particular moved for various reasons to a place in Christopher Street in New York, which is where the landmark and the Pride and everything is held today, to this day. I think that's pretty cool. And it worked as a bar and a nightclub until around the mid-1960s, when it caught on fire and closed down. So at this point, it's probably useful to mention that Greenwich Village, which is in the area of Manhattan, my geography is terrible, so feel free to look all of that stuff up, was a hub, like a place where a lot of I'm going to use the term gay people here as well. I particularly don't like the term gay being used as an overall umbrella term, but especially back in these days, it's in so many of the accounts, gay pride, gay people, because although it wasn't a new thing, the terminology was definitely a new thing, and terms like transgender, for example, didn't even exist. So a lot of people who were LGBT plus were just called gay at the time. And so a lot of gay people found themselves in Greenwich Village. And for the LGBT plus community at the time, this period of prohibition kind of worked well for them because it pushed the idea of alcohol and this sort of like party scene underground. And because at the time New York had laws against homosexuality, that was also pushed underground. And so it kind of married quite nicely to allow the two to happen together in the form of gay bars. Not at all saying it's right, but there were groups of people who were like the moral justice squads who would go around and, you know, like try to raid places and make sure that these immoral activities weren't happening. I'm using this because I don't actually deem it to be immoral and it feels wrong to say. Anyway, this guy right here, his name was Robert Warner, was the mayor of New York at the time. And he was not happy with the gay bars in the 60s, not at all. To try and put a stop to this, he did two sort of main things. The first thing he did was remove liquor licenses from bars, which meant that bars weren't allowed to sell alcohol and therefore kind of, you know, weren't the fun aspect of being a bar. And the second thing that happened around that time was something called entrapment, and it's where police officers would essentially try to trap gay people into coming out or disclosing in some way that they were gay in order to arrest them. So they would, for example, fake flirt, and if a person was gay and then invited them for drinks, sometimes if they weren't gay and they were just, you know, trying to be friendly, they were then arrested for solicitation. So if you're LGBT in that period of time, it is not a nice place to be. And also I think it's just worth mentioning at this point that there are some places, even in today's day and age, where that still happens. In a lot of developing countries, people are still not free to be who they are. That is a story, a fight for another day, but just wanted to put that out there. After a short space of time, New York got a new mayor called John Lindsay, and he wasn't fond of this entrapment, and I'm very pleased to say that it then ended. But the liquor licenses were still super strict, and because of that, not everyone could own bars, and it turned out that a lot of criminals instead owned the bars, like the mafia. And now Simpsons is starting to make a lot more sense, because Tony and yeah, you get it. So anyway, the criminals, the bar owners, didn't treat the bars or the people who attended the bars very well, but they didn't have to because they had a lot of the power. They would mistreat their customers, they would water down the alcohol, and they would charge a lot of money. They would overprice everything simply because they could. And the reason that they got away with all of this by selling the alcohol, even though they didn't have a license to do that, is because they had connections with the police. It was all a very corrupt circle. The police who were supposed to come to do raids were either being paid off by the mafia to not do the raids, or they were tipping the mafia to tell them when the raids were happening in exchange for money, so that when the raids did happen, they'd be like, oh yeah, you know, no alcohol here. Because they were given the time to prepare for it. And so the Stonewall Inn was no exception. The Stonewall Inn in particular was owned by the Genovese family. I think I'm saying that correctly. I've only ever seen it written down. This guy here is Vito. He was one of the leaders of the Genovese family. And the reason that it was so famous or known is because this family was one of the top 5 mafia families known as the most powerful in the crime circles at the time. So they bought the Stonewall Inn that had the big fire, they put a few $1,000s in it to renovate it, nothing fancy, but you know, and they basically turned it into a gay bar. It sounds like a nice thing that the mafia did, but do not be deceived. They did not do this to be nice. It shouldn't be a surprise to you at this point that loads of people were gay, and when they came to the bars, they didn't want to use their own identities, quite often because they were like these really private speakeasies. They would have like books where they would sign their names, but no one would use their real name because they were too embarrassed or shy to do that. And that's why it was really scary when police came, because it meant if they were being ID'd, they could be found out and outed, and their whole lives could be damaged, because it really was not easy to be gay or LGBT plus in any way back then. And so the mafia would often blackmail the customers, especially those who were really wealthy or who worked in like the financial districts like Wall Street. They knew that they held this power over these people, and it was quite a large revenue stream for them to know that they could blackmail people that came to their bar. So it was about once a week where the police would come and collect the contributions in exchange for the tip-offs of the raids. And Stonewall Inn in particular had no water, no fire escapes, the toilets were really, really grim. On accounts that I found by one particular historian, Carter, it really did not sound like a nice place to be. But the reason that the LGBT plus community went there is because it was one of the only places where you could get together and feel like you're in a community with other LGBT plus people. And the Stonewall Inn was the only gay bar that allowed dancing. And who doesn't like a little boogie? So envisage this. If you tried to go to the Stonewall Inn, what you would find is a door, and they had a bouncer behind the door who would look at you through the little peephole. And the way that you would get in is if either the bouncer knew you or if you looked gay. And it was quite strict because, again, quite often police would try to go in, and if they sort of unwittingly let in a police person, then it would shut the whole bar down. So to avoid undercover police, you'd either have to dress super duper gay or have a personal connection. It's who you know. If you were let in, you then paid an entrance fee. I think I found records that said it was around like $3 at the time. And for that price, what you would get is 2 tickets that you could then exchange in the bar for 2 alcoholic drinks. It was super dark in the bar, everything was black. And a really interesting thing for me, at least, to note is that the people that attended Stonewall Inn were hugely diverse in terms of colour and ethnicity. Reports account that actually it was a pretty equal mix between black people, white people and Hispanic people. And it didn't take long for Stonewall to have the reputation as being the gay bar in town. So as well as police coming weekly to collect money for the raids, the actual raids would happen on average once a month. And because of the corruption money that was being collected, the mafia always sort of knew when the raids were happening, they'd be prepared, they'd keep extra alcohol in locked secret places just in case the alcohol was taken away, so that after the raid they could get back up and running with business. And the way that they'd signal to the customers that a raid was happening is that they'd switch the lights. So instead of being black lights, they would turn into bright white lights. And once people saw those lights, they knew that they were to stop dancing, stop touching, the police were here. At that point, they would have to line up and present their ID cards. And again, the police were treating people really unfair at the time. So people who were dressed as women, regardless of whether they actually were women or not, would be searched by female police officers, and the officers would take them to the bathroom and essentially get them to expose themselves so that they could verify their sex. And if they found men dressing as women, then they would arrest them. There were also other really weird, quirky rules that just was so unfair. You know, women, for example, had to wear 3 pieces of female clothing, and if they were not seen wearing 3 pieces of clothing, they could also be arrested. And also, people who worked at these kind of bars were regularly arrested. And so the Stonewall riots that we talk about today happened one night on Saturday, the 28th of June, 1969. The party had gone on for quite a long time, and it was actually nearing about 1:30 in the morning when this police raid happened. Again, there are conflicting accounts. Some people say that the mafia weren't tipped off on this one. Others say that they were, but they chose to ignore the tip because they thought it was inaccurate because of how late it was. Regardless, a group of police came to the door and they burst in and they shouted, "Police, we're taking the place!" The lights were turned on, people were asked to line up with their ID cards out, and they were being led out of the bar. So as I said, normally at this point the female police officers would take everyone dressed as women, lead them out to the bathroom to verify whether they were in fact female. But on this particular night, the drag queens refused to go. They just resisted. Similarly, the people in the queues who were being checked by the police officers just refused to give their ID. With all of this tension and hesitance and resistance, there was a huge sense of discomfort that sort of spread within the bar, and it led to police doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing and people doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing. And there are accounts that the police then started, for example, frisking lesbians who really didn't want to be touched. In this feeling of tension and hostility, the police then started seizing the alcohol. And again, for reasons where one thing led to another, the wagons were late, the wagons that come up that the police used to take the alcohol away from the venue. And whilst there was this big commotion and the police were waiting to put the alcohol in the wagons, a crowd started forming outside because they were like, "Hey, what's going on? Why is there so much noise? What's happening?" And what was really interesting is at this point, the visitors of the bar, who would usually run away at this point because they weren't being handcuffed and they knew that a raid was happening, they'd normally run away to try and stay clear of that and avoid being arrested. They weren't actually running away. They were staying to sort of hold their ground and complain a bit to the police. Again, there are reports that at this point, when the police were trying to kick them out and say, get out, you shouldn't be here, the people in the bar were almost taunting the police. They were doing things like saluting in a really exaggerated fashion, and it got the crowd going because the crowd kept forming louder, and at some points they would then start to applause and, encourage the people who were taunting the police. The wagons eventually came, the alcohol was being seized, people were being arrested, and there were people in the crowds who started saying things like gay power and we shall overcome. There's actually a beautiful quote that I found from Edmund White, who was there on the night and recalled, "Everyone is restless, angry and high-spirited. No one has a slogan, no one even has an attitude, but something's brewing." I obviously realise that this isn't the happiest of stories to be telling, but there's something quite poetic and powerful and moving about knowing that there was this sense of electricity in the air that people could almost feel the vibe of, and it made people, for once, come together and stand together. At this point outside there were rumours that the people inside the bar still were being beaten by the police, and the crowds were not happy with this. And so they started throwing things like pennies, bottles, and one specific lady who was arrested and in handcuffs and was being led out of the bar that night was heavily resisting and shouted at the crowd something like, "Well, what are you doing? Why don't you do something?" And it was at that point that a huge fight then started. It got the crowd going, they all broke into a big riot. The police tried to restrain people, but they just weren't being very successful with it. One of the inspectors at the time, I think it was Inspector Pine, ordered some of the police to go in some of the wagons. Tyres were being slashed, but the ones that could move had started going off, and he ordered them to come back quite quickly. Another rumour had been circulating, saying that the reason that the raids happened was because the police weren't being paid off, and I think someone shouted something like, "Oh, let's give the pigs the money they wanted then." Even more coins were being thrown, even more beer cans were being thrown, and more passers-by were seeing what was happening, coming in, and then joining in with the big riot. There are about 10 police officers who are still in the Stonewall Inn at this point, and for their own safety they blocked themselves in along with some other goers who were there to visit the bar who didn't manage to get out. One of my favourite quotes that I found here was from a reference called Carter, and someone called Michael Fader, who was there that night, summarised the feeling in what I think is quite a poetic way. He said, "We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of this kind of shit. It wasn't anything tangible anyone said to anyone else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night, in the one particular place. And it was not an organised demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt that we were never going to go back. It was like the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us. All kinds of people, all different reasons, but mostly it was total outrage, anger, sorrow, everything combined, and everything just kind of ran its course. It was the police who were doing most of the destruction. We were really trying to get back in and break free, and we felt that we had freedom at last, or freedom to at least show that we demanded freedom. We weren't going to be walking meekly in the night and letting them shove us around. It's like standing your ground for the first time and in a really strong way, and that's what caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air. Freedom a long time overdue, and we were going to fight for it. It took different forms, but the bottom line was we weren't going to go away, and we didn't. And it didn't just end there. Instead of just being bottles and coins, bins were being thrown, rocks, bricks, everything was being thrown at the Stonewall Inn to get to these police. Windows were being smashed, and there were even reports that they'd managed to lift off one of those parking meters from the ground and were using it as a battering ram to try and open the Stonewall Inn doors. I think at this point it's also important to note that there were two people who were well known, or are still well known, for having led the riots, and that is Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. These were two beautiful self-identifying drag queens, and although the words didn't exist back then, it seems that they were both gender non-conforming in some form of way. Some people claim that one or the other of them weren't actually there on the first nights of the riots, but there are quite a lot of accounts that say that they both were. But regardless of what accounts you read, both Sylvia and Marsha both played huge and pivotal roles in starting this LGBT+ liberation movement during the period of the Stonewall Uprising in its total form. And I think it's really important to recognise that it was actually two trans people of colour who started the wheels turning on the LGBT+ liberation movement. I think it's a fact that's quite often forgotten and not appreciated, and I find it really funny, I guess, not in a good way, that in light of this, trans people, and especially trans people of colour, are perhaps the most underrepresented group within the LGBT+ community. Just baffles me. Anyway, as the Stonewall riots continued, some of the windows were smashed open, someone had ended up squirting some lighter fluid into the Stonewall Inn, and it started a big fire. I think the whole ordeal lasted for about 45 minutes before more police came to help free the police that were trapped within Stonewall Inn. There were a lot of people harmed that night. Some were policemen, some were people who were actually in the bar. With greater and greater police forces turning up, they advanced on the streets and cleared the streets back, and it's quite a big, powerful image that comes up in quite a lot of accounts. There were these lines of police forces with their giant protective shields, and on the other side, lines of people who are doing kickback dances and singing songs, and it just feels so surreal and contradictory to think that that could have even happened. People were singing and dancing, and the police were beating them for it and trying to get them to go away and stop causing such a fuss. One particular historian reference says that that night 13 people were arrested. Certain people were hospitalised for heavy beatings. Someone was also hospitalised for losing a few fingers in a car door. 4 police officers were injured, and the Stonewall Inn itself was completely trashed. The next day, the major newspapers did cover the riots, and throughout the day, graffiti started to show up in and around the area. People would come to witness it, to see the place, and over the bars and those certain areas, things were written like drag power and support gay power and legalise gay bars. And that very night, the riots started again, except this time there were far more people. There are so many different accounts, right? So some people say that the riots the second day were even worse than the first, others say it was a little bit nicer, but this time there were thousands of people to the point where they were spilling off Christopher Street and into nearby streets too. Again, Sylvia and Marsha led quite a lot of these riots. There are accounts that Marsha had climbed a lamppost and dropped a really heavy bag on a police car that shattered the windshield, and it caused just lots of people, I guess, to stand up and rally together and continue with showing and demonstrating that they were not happy with being suppressed. Carter, the historian that I had referenced earlier, collected a lot of references and interview quotes from people who were there, and one attendee exclaimed how surreal it was from going to places where you had to know the person on the door and speak to someone through a peephole. We were just out in the streets. It does sound really crazy, and I'm not at all suggesting that I would have wanted to be there, but it also just sounds so inspiring and powerful to think that everyone just joined forces in that way. There were more police, there was more demonstrating, there was more arrests, and eventually it all cleared. The next week there was a lot of pressure being put on the mayor to sort all of these situations out, and there were also lots of leaflets being posted around saying that mafia and criminals should no longer own gay bars, it should be gay people who own these spaces for themselves. It generated a lot of publicity, and that's really what started the LGBT+ movement. Within about 6 months of the riots happening, a new paper formed, and it was called Gay, and it was a really big deal because the biggest paper at the time refused to print the word gay. They used slurs like the F word and other things to refer to LGBT+ people. The raids also didn't stop happening at this point. It didn't get better immediately, and as for Stonewall, the inn itself, it closed and dried up after a few weeks. So if we fast forward a year, on the 28th of June 1970, the very first anniversary of Stonewall took place. It was called Christopher Street Liberation Day, and a ton of people gathered there on the steps of what used to be the Stonewall Inn to assemble, to remember, to speak for LGBT+ rights, and at the exact same time, in LA and also in Chicago, other marches had been coordinated, and these 3 marches that happened in New York, Chicago and LA were the first Pride marches ever to happen in US history. That's pretty cool. The next year, places all around the world started to hold Pride. London was one of them, so was Dallas, Stockholm. Lots of people took to the streets to either be proud of their own LGBT+ identities or support LGBT+ people as allies. And the liberation movement just kept going from there. It's still not great, don't get me wrong, we still have such a way to go, but to think about Pride now and how millions and millions of people take up the streets of London like we will be doing this Saturday, in comparison to these people who were far smaller in number and still getting quite a lot of hate and resistance, is just humbling. But yes, although we still got a while to go, that was a story of Stonewall and how it all came about. There were riots that happened before Stonewall, but people say that the reason that Stonewall in particular was picked up and lasted and made such a difference was because it happened over multiple days. There were thousands of people who partook, and also it got a lot of media coverage. All of those factors together just led to more and more people standing up and doing something about it. I guess it just shows the power of the people, right? And how we have strength in numbers by having a platform that can make such a difference. Oh, gets me all riled up. Anyway, before I make this video too long, that is in essence the summary of Stonewall. I hope if you guys hadn't heard of it or had only heard a little bit before, it's given you a high level insight into what actually happened and where it all came from and why we all have to be so thankful for the generations before us who really paved the way to allow us to be proud in expressing who we are. And I hope as well that you found it at least a little bit inspiring or fascinating or moving in the same way that I did. If you would like to read up about it, I'll of course leave the references downstairs in the description box. You can do so. For now, let's go and enjoy Pride. Comment below, let me know if you guys are actually going to any Prides. If you're going to London Pride or Trans Pride in Brighton, Jamie and I will certainly be there, but one thing that I will just ask of you, whichever Pride you're going to, just remember why we're there in the first place. Yes, Pride is an amazing party. Yes, wear your glitter, be loud, be proud, dance, sing, shout from the rooftops, but just be respectful and remind yourself that Pride is not just a party. It started off as a protest and there's some really important progress that is still to be made, and we should all be mindful of that and mindful of how powerful our voices are as one. Alright, before I turn into a giant cheese ball, happy Pride! Thank you for watching and I will catch you with another vlog on Monday. Be kind and have a great day. Bye!